My father considered me a loser and believed I would achieve nothing on my own. But his brother helped me and gave me $50,000 to start. After my uncle's death, I inherited his fortune. My father got nothing, and then he... So, here's the thing. I've always felt like the odd one out in my family. It's not just the typical I'm different teenage phase. No, this feeling has followed me into adulthood, and I'm pushing 30. My family, especially my dad, has always treated me like I'm somehow less than everyone else. It probably doesn't help that they're all really successful and have this incredible drive that I never seem to inherit. Growing up, I was the kid who couldn't decide what he wanted for dinner, let alone what he wanted out of life. My dad, a relentless powerhouse of a man, always said I was soft and lacking in ambition. He used to say that I had the backbone of a jellyfish. Yeah, real nice guy. He never seemed to understand that not everyone has to be ruthless to find their place in the world. But, in his eyes, my reluctance to bulldoze through life like he did was a sign of weakness. Then there was my uncle, Dad's younger brother. He was something else entirely, kind of a black sheep in his own right, but with a twist. Uncle Ron had this way of making everyone around him feel like they were the most important person in the room. He was everything my dad wasn't: warm, approachable, and, above all, supportive. He never saw my sensitivity as a weakness. In fact, he once told me he admired it. Said I had something special that set me apart. Uncle Ron was loaded. Like, millionaire loaded. He owned several businesses and had more investments than I could count. But he wasn't flashy about it. He wore old jeans and drove a beat-up truck. But when he walked into a room, people noticed. He had this aura of calm power. My dad hated that about him, probably because he didn't understand it. Ron could charm the socks off anyone, but he did it without trying, without effort. And for some reason, he liked me. One day, completely out of the blue, he called me over to his place. We sat on his back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. That's when he hit me with his offer. "I know you've always felt a little unseen in this family," he started. "But I think you've got potential, kid. You just need a push." I remember laughing a little, thinking he was joking. "A push?" I asked, half expecting him to throw a pep talk my way and leave it at that. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a check, and slid it across the table. $50,000. My jaw nearly hit the floor. "Consider this an investment in your future," he said, his face serious. "I'm giving you a shot. Take this money, learn the business world, and prove to yourself and everyone else that you can do it. There's only one condition. You can't use it to coast. You've got to invest it, make it grow, learn the ropes." I just sat there, stunned. I mean, $50,000 wasn't just pocket change. It was real money, and the way he said it, it was like he genuinely believed I could turn it into something bigger. Over the next few weeks, I dove into the world of investments. I started by reading everything I could get my hands on: books, articles, even old forum posts about stocks, bonds, and other investments. It was overwhelming at first, like learning a new language. But every time I hit a roadblock, I remembered the way my uncle looked at me that night. It was the first time anyone in my family had looked at me with anything other than disappointment. I wasn't just some lazy kid to him. I was a project, a challenge. I started small, putting a few thousand here and there into safer investments, trying to get a feel for things. The first time I saw a return, no matter how tiny, I felt this strange thrill. It was addictive. I'd always been told I couldn't do anything right, that I wasn't ambitious enough, but here I was, watching my money grow. It was small steps, but each one felt like a victory. I was finally doing something that wasn't handed to me on a silver platter, and it felt good. Damn good. That's how I found myself staying up late, poring over financial reports, analyzing stocks, and trying to understand what made one investment better than another. I knew I was just scratching the surface, but it was enough to keep me going. For the first time in my life, I felt motivated, driven even. It was like I had found a part of myself I never knew existed, one that actually wanted to work hard, to succeed. The real kicker, though? I wasn't doing it for my dad. I wasn't even doing it for Uncle Ron, though I wanted to make him proud. I was doing it for me. I wanted to prove that I wasn't the weak, aimless guy my dad thought I was. I wanted to be someone who could take $50,000 and turn it into something that mattered. And so, I kept at it. Day after day, little by little, I started building a small portfolio. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time, I felt like I was on the path to something real. With a few wins under my belt, I was riding high, but life had a way of reminding me that things don't always go as planned. One day, while I was going through some of Uncle Ron's old files, just trying to learn as much as I could, I stumbled upon something that changed everything. It all started with a simple folder, hidden at the back of a drawer in the study. I'd been using Uncle Ron's office as my own since his sudden passing, finding comfort in the remnants of his world, where I felt closer to him. That day, I was looking for a document he'd mentioned once, something about an early investment strategy, but what I found was much more personal. The folder was labeled with a simple HS, initials that didn't make sense at first. Curious, I opened it up, expecting to find business papers, maybe some old contracts. Instead, I found a series of letters, all handwritten, addressed to someone named Helen. They dated back decades, some from before I was even born. The first letter was short, barely a page, but as I skimmed through it, my heart started to race. Uncle Ron had been in love. Deeply, hopelessly, passionately in love. And not just a casual romance. This was something profound, something that had clearly shaped his life. The letters told a story of a relationship filled with dreams and plans for the future, a life they were building together. But by the time I got to the last letter, it was clear that things hadn't gone as planned. Uncle Ron had poured his heart out to Helen, begging her to come back to him, telling her he'd do anything to make things right. My heart sank as I read his final words. I lost you because I was too focused on building a future. I couldn't see that my future was already here, right in front of me. I was too blind to realize that you were all I ever needed. I sat there, holding that letter, feeling like I'd been given a glimpse into a side of Uncle Ron I'd never known. I realized that despite all his wealth and success, he'd carried a deep wound, a regret that even all his money couldn't heal. I wondered if he'd ever told anyone about Helen, or if she was a secret he'd kept all to himself. Had he lived the rest of his life with that loss hanging over him, a constant reminder of what he'd sacrificed for success? The discovery of these letters changed something in me. I'd been so focused on proving myself, on making something of the money he'd given me, that I hadn't stopped to think about what kind of life I was building. Was I following in his footsteps, repeating his mistakes? Was I so caught up in the thrill of the business world that I'd end up sacrificing something just as precious? I found myself haunted by those questions. I couldn't stop thinking about Helen and what might have been. I didn't want to live with those same regrets, to reach the end of my life only to realize I'd missed out on what truly mattered. It made me question everything I'd been doing, the path I was on, and whether it was really worth it. I kept the letters, hiding them back in the drawer where I'd found them, but they stayed with me. They changed the way I saw Uncle Ron, and in a strange way, they made me feel closer to him. I realized that he wasn't just my uncle or my mentor. He was a man who had lived, loved, and lost. He had his own struggles, his own pain, and somehow, knowing that made him more real to me. The experience grounded me, reminding me that success wasn't everything. I didn't want to end up like Uncle Ron, with nothing but regrets about the people I'd lost along the way. I knew I had to find a balance, to make sure that while I was building my future, I wasn't sacrificing my present. It was a sobering realization, but one that I knew I needed. From that day on, I worked with a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just doing it for the money or to prove my father wrong. I was doing it for myself, for the life I wanted to build. I made a promise to myself that I would find a way to balance both, to build a successful career without losing sight of what truly mattered. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time, I felt like I had a direction, a sense of what I wanted my life to look like. As I delved deeper into my work, I started reaching out more, making time for the people in my life, building connections that weren't just about business. I wanted to make sure that when I looked back, I wouldn't have any regrets. I wouldn't be the man who had it all, but lost the one thing that mattered most. But just when I thought I had everything figured out, life threw another curveball my way. It came in the form of an unexpected visitor, someone who knew Uncle Ron even better than I did. One day, as I was leaving the office, I noticed a woman standing by the entrance. She was older, with silver hair and a graceful demeanor, and there was something about her that felt familiar, even though I was certain I'd never met her before. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Are you Ron's nephew?" I nodded, surprised. "Yes, I am. Did you know him?" A smile flickered across her face, a mixture of sadness and fondness. "I did. My name is Helen." I felt a jolt run through me. Helen, the woman from the letters, the love of his life. I could hardly believe it. After all these years, she was standing right in front of me. I didn't know what to say, and for a moment, we just stood there in silence, each of us processing the weight of the moment. "I've heard a lot about you," she said finally, breaking the silence. "Ron was very proud of you, you know. He told me about the investment he'd made, how much he believed in you." I felt a lump in my throat, and I tried to find the right words. I found his letters, I admitted, unsure of how she would react. I didn't mean to pry, but I had no idea. Her face softened, and she nodded. "He never stopped loving me," she said, a hint of sadness in her voice. "But life has a way of moving on, doesn't it?" We talked for a while, right there on the sidewalk, as she shared stories about Uncle Ron that I'd never heard before. She told me about their plans, their dreams, and the moments they'd shared. It was like I was seeing a new side of him, a side that was vulnerable, open, and deeply human. I felt a surge of emotion as I realized how much I'd missed out on, how much I'd never known about the man who'd been such a big part of my life. Before she left, she turned to me and said something that I'll never forget. "Ron always believed in second chances," she said, her eyes kind and wise. "Whatever you're facing, remember that. Life is full of second chances, but you have to be brave enough to take them." I watched her walk away, feeling a strange sense of peace. Uncle Ron had left me more than just money. He'd left me a legacy, a set of values, a reminder that life is about more than just success. It's about the people you love, the moments you cherish, and the courage to make the most of every opportunity. As I returned to my work, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I knew there would be challenges ahead, that my father and others might try to bring me down, but I also knew that I had the strength to face whatever came my way. I had a new perspective, a deeper understanding of what mattered, and a reminder that no matter how hard things got, there was always a chance to start over, to make things right. Uncle Ron's legacy wasn't just about wealth or success. It was about living a life with no regrets, about taking risks, making mistakes, and finding the courage to keep going. And I was ready to honor that legacy, to build a life that would make him proud, a life that I could look back on with a sense of pride and fulfillment. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, I felt ready. I wasn't just chasing success. I was chasing a life worth living, a life that balanced ambition with love, risk with reward, and dreams with reality. And no matter what came next, I knew I had the strength to face it, to rise above the challenges, and to create a future that was truly my own. After a few months, things really started to change. My investments were finally beginning to show returns. I'd managed to turn Uncle Ron's $50,000 into a little over $80,000. It might not sound like a huge leap, but for me, it was monumental. I felt this rush of pride and confidence that I'd never experienced before. For the first time, I felt like I was in control, and I could feel the momentum building. The surprising part? My family started to notice. At family dinners, people would actually ask me how I was doing. My cousins, who'd previously avoided me like I had some contagious lack of ambition, suddenly wanted to hear all about my investments. Even my mom, who usually kept out of these things, would smile and squeeze my hand, whispering how proud she was. And then there was my dad. He started out congratulating me, though it was a little strained, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. I could tell he was skeptical, but the more I succeeded, the more he seemed to accept that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the failure he'd always thought I was. There was even a part of me that hoped we could finally bridge that gap, maybe even have the relationship I'd always wanted. But as the weeks passed, I sensed something was off. Dad's congratulations became less enthusiastic, and he seemed more interested in dissecting my strategies than celebrating my wins. At first, I thought he was just being his usual tough love self. But then he started making subtle digs, questioning my methods, pointing out risks I hadn't considered, and reminding me of times in the past when I dropped the ball. It was like he couldn't stand to see me doing well without inserting some doubt. One night, he flat out told me he thought I was taking things too fast. "You've had some lucky breaks, but luck doesn't last," he said, swirling his glass of whiskey. "You need to think about a backup plan. You don't want to end up back at square one." I felt the sting in his words. It wasn't that he was offering advice. It was more like he was waiting for me to mess up, as if he needed to be proven right. But then, the unthinkable happened. A couple of my investments started to tank. I'd put a chunk of money into a company that, for reasons beyond my control, plummeted overnight. Just like that, a third of my portfolio was gone. I felt sick to my stomach watching the numbers drop, powerless to stop it. The market was brutal, unforgiving, and I was feeling every bit of it. At first, I tried to play it cool, telling myself it was just a blip, that things would bounce back. But they didn't. One bad day turned into 2, then 3. My confidence was crumbling, and the worst part was that I couldn't stop hearing my dad's voice in my head, reminding me that luck doesn't last. I started to wonder if he'd been right all along, if I really was just a screw-up pretending to know what he was doing. I tried not to let on to my family just how bad things had gotten, but my dad must have sensed it. He cornered me one evening, asking about my latest returns, and I could barely look him in the eye as I admitted the losses. I half expected him to gloat, but instead, he just nodded, his face unreadable. "I told you it wasn't that easy," he said, not unkindly. "Business is about survival, not luck. I've survived because I don't take risks I can't afford to lose." I felt hollow. For the first time in months, I doubted myself. Maybe I wasn't cut out for this after all. I had practically burned through my uncle's investment, and all I had to show for it was a sinking feeling of failure. And then Uncle Ron called. I hadn't told him about the losses, but somehow he knew. He invited me over to his house again, and when I walked in, he gave me a bear hug, as if nothing had changed. I finally broke down and told him everything, expecting him to be disappointed. But he just listened, nodding thoughtfully as I spilled my guts. When I was done, he smiled and put a hand on my shoulder. "It's okay to fail," he said. "It's part of the process. You think I got where I am without losing a fortune or two along the way. Hell, I've made more mistakes than you could imagine. But you know what? Each one taught me something valuable." It was like a weight lifted off my shoulders. I realized that while my dad saw failure as a weakness, Uncle Ron saw it as a stepping stone. He didn't care that I'd messed up. He cared that I was learning, that I was trying. Then, he surprised me by pulling out another check, not quite as hefty as the first, but enough to keep me afloat. "This isn't a handout," he warned. "It's a loan. You'll pay me back when you can. But I believe in you, and I want to see what you can do. Don't let a few setbacks scare you off." I took the check, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Uncle Ron's support meant the world to me, and I was determined not to let him down. I threw myself back into the market with a new perspective, using the losses as a lesson rather than a deterrent. For the first time, I wasn't just trying to prove my dad wrong. I was trying to prove to myself that I could do this. The ups and downs were brutal, but I was learning. I started making safer bets, taking calculated risks instead of wild ones, and slowly, my portfolio began to stabilize. I wasn't out of the woods yet, but I felt more prepared, more resilient. I was beginning to understand that success wasn't about never falling. It was about getting back up every time you did. And with Uncle Ron in my corner, I knew I could face whatever came next. Things had just started to feel stable again when the world turned upside down. One morning, I got a call that Uncle Ron had passed away suddenly. I couldn't believe it. It felt surreal, like it couldn't be real. He was one of the healthiest, most energetic people I knew. I hadn't even considered the possibility of losing him. But here I was, sitting in a stuffy office with my family, trying to process that he was gone. We were gathered for the reading of his will. I don't think any of us knew what to expect. Uncle Ron had always been private about his finances, and he never seemed particularly concerned with who got what. I figured he'd leave the bulk of his estate to charity or maybe split it evenly among family members. I never imagined what was coming. The lawyer cleared his throat and began to read, and I felt my heart pounding as he listed off various bequests. When he got to the part about me, I almost fell out of my chair. Uncle Ron had left me a massive chunk of his fortune. Not just a little, but enough to set me up for life. Enough to give me security and freedom that I never thought I'd have. And then I heard my dad's name, and I knew something was wrong. Uncle Ron had left him almost nothing. Just a token amount, a gesture really, as if to acknowledge his existence without actually rewarding him. The room went silent, and I could feel the tension like a physical weight pressing down on us. I risked a glance at my dad and saw his face turning red, his fists clenching as he absorbed the news. As soon as the reading was over, he stormed out of the room without a word, and I followed, not knowing what else to do. I caught up to him outside, and he spun around to face me, his eyes blazing with anger. "What the hell did you do?" he hissed. I took a step back, stunned by the accusation. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb with me," he snapped. "You think I don't see what's going on here? You manipulated him. You poisoned him against me, didn't you? You've always been jealous, always trying to take what's mine." I felt my mouth go dry. "Dad, I didn't do anything," I protested, but he wasn't listening. He was on a rant, venting years of pent-up frustration and anger, and I realized that it wasn't really about the inheritance. This was about control. This was about power. He couldn't stand the idea that I had something he didn't, that I had somehow outmaneuvered him. For days, I avoided him, hoping he'd calm down, but things only got worse. He started calling, texting, leaving voicemails demanding that I make things right. At first, he was subtle, asking if I'd consider sharing a portion of the inheritance, appealing to family loyalty and all that. He talked about how much he'd sacrificed, how he'd worked so hard to build a life for us, and how it wasn't fair that I should have so much while he had so little. But when I didn't respond the way he wanted, his tone shifted. He became manipulative, bringing up past mistakes, trying to guilt me into giving him what he wanted. "You owe me," he'd say, reminding me of all the times he'd paid for things, how he'd raised me, how everything I had was because of him. It was like he couldn't see me as my own person, as someone who'd earned something on his own. To him, I was just an extension of himself, and I owed him loyalty, respect, and apparently now, money. The worst part was, he didn't just stop with me. He started talking to other family members, trying to turn them against me. He painted me as this greedy, selfish person who'd betrayed his own father, who'd stolen from him and left him with nothing. I could feel the shift whenever I spoke to anyone else. My cousins, my aunt, they were more distant, more guarded, as if they were wondering if the things he was saying about me were true. I thought about giving in, just to make it all go away. It was tempting to just hand over a chunk of the inheritance and avoid the drama, but deep down, I knew that wouldn't solve anything. He would always want more. He would never see me as an equal, someone deserving of what I'd earned. He would always see me as someone who owed him, and that realization filled me with a kind of sadness I hadn't expected. So, one day, I called him up and told him we needed to talk. We met at a diner, a place I'd hoped would be neutral enough to keep things civil. But the moment I walked in, I knew there was no chance of that. He was already glaring at me, his posture stiff, his expression hard. I sat down, trying to keep my voice steady. "Dad, I'm not giving you the inheritance," I said, bracing myself for the fallout. "I know you're upset, but this isn't about you and me. Uncle Ron made his choice, and I'm not going to undermine his decision just because you're unhappy about it." His face twisted into a sneer. "You ungrateful little." He cut himself off, breathing hard, and I could see him struggling to keep his temper in check. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? You think you're better than me now? You think you've won?" "It's not about winning," I replied, feeling my own anger rising. "This is about respect. Uncle Ron respected me, and he trusted me. I'm not going to betray that because you can't handle it." For a moment, he just stared at me, and I thought maybe I'd finally gotten through to him. But then he leaned across the table, his eyes cold. "You're going to regret this," he said, his voice low and menacing. I don't care what it takes. I'll get back what's mine." With that, he got up and walked out, leaving me sitting there, heart pounding, unsure of what to do next. I'd known there would be fallout, but I hadn't expected it to be so vicious, so personal. He wasn't just angry, he was out for blood. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. He started spreading rumors, talking to anyone who would listen, trying to ruin my reputation. It was like he was determined to make me pay, not just financially but emotionally too. He wanted me to feel as small and powerless as he did, and he was willing to go to any lengths to make that happen. But despite the chaos, I felt a strange sense of calm. I knew I'd made the right choice. I knew that I was finally standing up for myself, refusing to let him control me, refusing to let him dictate my life. And even though it hurt, even though I could feel the distance growing between me and my family, I knew it was necessary. This was my life, my inheritance, my chance to build something for myself, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. I braced myself for what was to come, knowing that this was just the beginning. My dad wasn't the kind of person to back down, and I had no idea what he was planning. But for the first time, I felt ready to face whatever he threw at me. I was done being the outsider, done being the person everyone underestimated. This was my fight now, and I was ready to take it on, no matter what it cost. After our confrontation, Dad went all out. He was determined to ruin me, and he had the connections to make it happen. He started calling up anyone who would listen, spreading rumors and twisting the truth until it was unrecognizable. I knew he had his pride, but I didn't expect him to go this far. It wasn't just about the inheritance anymore. He wanted to destroy me, to drag me down until there was nothing left. The rumors started slowly, almost imperceptibly. A few cold shoulders here, an awkward conversation there. People I'd done business with for months, people who'd once congratulated me on my success, now seemed hesitant to even talk to me. I tried to ignore it at first, hoping it would blow over. But then one of my partners pulled me aside and told me what was really going on. Apparently, Dad had been spreading stories about me, claims that I was reckless, that I'd taken advantage of Uncle Ron, that I was gambling away the inheritance. He even hinted that I'd manipulated Uncle Ron when he was vulnerable, convincing him to change the will out of spite. It was a twisted version of reality, but I could see how people might believe it, especially coming from him. He had this way of sounding so convincing, so authoritative, that people just assumed he knew what he was talking about. The worst part was that some people did believe him. I started losing clients, investors began to pull out, and suddenly, the foundation I'd worked so hard to build was crumbling. I couldn't understand how he could do this to his own son. It was like he'd made it his mission to ruin me, as if my success was a personal affront to him. I felt betrayed, heartbroken, and furious all at once. But then, something clicked. I realized that I couldn't let him win. I had fought too hard, come too far, to let him drag me back down. If he wanted a fight, I was going to give him one. So, I started gathering evidence, collecting every document, email, and piece of proof I had to show that I was legitimate, that I had earned everything on my own. I decided to organize a presentation, a kind of public reckoning. I invited everyone I could think of, clients, partners, friends, even family members who'd been swayed by his lies. I wanted to set the record straight once and for all. This was my chance to take control of the narrative, to show everyone that I wasn't the person he was making me out to be. The day of the presentation, I was nervous as hell. I could feel my heart pounding as I stood in front of the room, but I knew I had to do this. I started by walking everyone through my journey, from the first check Uncle Ron had given me to the ups and downs I'd faced along the way. I talked about the lessons I'd learned, the mistakes I'd made, and the ways I'd grown. And then, I laid out the evidence, proof that I'd managed Uncle Ron's assets responsibly, that I'd worked hard, that I'd earned every bit of my success. By the time I was finished, the room was silent. I could see people processing everything I'd said, and I could tell that some of them had changed their minds. They'd seen the truth, and they couldn't deny it. I knew it wouldn't fix everything overnight, but it was a start. I could feel the weight lifting, the sense of relief that came from finally standing up for myself, from taking control of my own story. As people started to leave, a few came up to shake my hand, to apologize for believing the worst. I could see that not everyone would be won over, but it didn't matter. I had done what I needed to do. I had proven myself, not just to them, but to myself. But there was still one loose end to tie up. I knew that as long as my dad was in my life, he would keep trying to pull me down. So, I made the hardest decision I'd ever had to make. I called him up and told him that we were done. No more family dinners, no more forced conversations, no more pretending that we had anything to say to each other. I was cutting him out of my life, once and for all. He tried to argue, tried to make me feel guilty, but I stood firm. I told him that I didn't need his approval, that I wasn't going to let him control me anymore. For the first time, I felt a sense of peace, like I was finally free. I knew it would be painful, but I also knew that it was necessary. I couldn't keep living in his shadow, couldn't keep letting him define who I was. With him out of the picture, I was able to focus on my future. I threw myself into managing Uncle Ron's assets, growing the portfolio, making investments that I believed in. I started to see results, started to rebuild the trust one had lost. I even reached out to some of the people who had turned away from me, explaining my side of the story, and slowly but surely, I began to rebuild my reputation. The freedom was exhilarating. I was finally my own person, finally living on my own terms. I didn't have to answer to anyone, didn't have to prove anything to anyone but myself. I could make my own decisions, take my own risks, and I didn't have to worry about what anyone else thought. It was a new beginning, a fresh start, and I was ready to embrace it. I knew that some people would always see me as the outsider, the black sheep who'd somehow gotten lucky. But I also knew that I had earned my place, that I had proven myself, and that I didn't need anyone's approval to be happy. For the first time in my life, I felt a sense of independence, a sense of pride that I had never felt before. I could finally look in the mirror and see someone who was strong, someone who was capable, someone who was worthy. I wasn't the weak, spineless kid my dad had always accused me of being. I was someone who had faced adversity, who had fought back, who had taken control of his own life. As I looked out over the city from my office window, I knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be new challenges, new obstacles, but I was ready for them. I had faced my biggest demon and come out on the other side. I was no longer the outsider. I was the master of my own destiny, and nothing could take that away from me. I knew that I still had a lot to prove, a lot to accomplish, but I also knew that I had the strength and the resilience to make it happen. I had finally found my place, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it away from me. This was my life, my future, and I was ready to live it on my own terms. If you like this story, subscribe right away and listen to new stories every day. Let us know what you like the most in the comments.